Welcome to the T's and C's,
Tisa and Chantal,
also known as the Terms and Conditions.
Good morning, listeners. It is week 5 or week 40? No,
Four.
We're week 4 of Surviving Society presents T's and C's, the reflection during the COVID-19 global pandemic. This week, we are really privileged to be joined by Professor Nasar Meer, who is a professor of race and citizenship and migration. Nasar,
it's in the mix somewhere.
In the mix. Edinburgh Uni. Nasar is Surviving Society alumni. You might remember he blew our minds with trains and public transports as microclimates.
He's ruined the train. He's ruined the trains for me.
I honestly, every time I get on the train now, I think about that.
Ruined the trains. Suspicious I am of everyone. What are you looking at? Why are you looking at me?
Nasar's going to talk to us. Obviously, we're going to have our usual chats about COVID-19 and the issues with race and capitalism, but Nasar's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the hidden victims and populations that we need to be thinking about during this time. Over to you, Nasar.
Sure, so great to be here. I guess the opening kind of observation to make is in all the uncertainty accompanying COVID-19, it's easy to forget that safety is a bit of a relative concept.
Yes.
And whilst COVID-19 affects everybody, it won't do so equally. And for millions of people in refugee camps and informal settlements, the pandemic posed a really terrifying threat, I think, in a way in which lays bare all the inadequacies of the way in which governments around the world approach refugee resettlement. If you think about some of the biggest camps, places like Cox's Bazar, which is home to about 850,000 refugees who fled Myanmar, Rohingya refugees. They're living in confined shelters. The population density is such that about 40,000 people share a kilometre squared. So social distancing is impossible. There's no hand washing stations, no triage centres, no isolation places, and no clean running water. And what's true of Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh it's true the world over, from people who are displaced obviously in Syria, Venezuela, Idlib province. We've seen on the border with the US and Mexico, the Ciudad Suarez, which is a kind of a shanty town which has developed there. And there's places like Al-Hol in Syria and the Tari camp in Jordan, to name the most obvious. But I suppose it's really here in Europe that a really unfortunate set of circumstances are unfolding in real time. This is principally an issue in a lot of the islands surrounding Greece, which were points of first entry into Europe from Turkey. And what's happened with the deal to try to stem the movement of people from the Middle East into Europe via Turkey into Cyprus has been that the people there are just trapped. They can't really move on. And so you've got this swelling of displaced migrants and refugees in these camps which aren't fit for purpose. Most of them weren't ever designed to be camps. Disease is already rife. I mean, there's people from British medics out there who talk about how in one camp, the Moira camp in Lesbos, depending on how you pronounce it, there's an outbreak of scabies. So, in 21st century Europe, you've got untreated scabies on European soil and no proper intervention to try to address it. So you've got people living in close quarters, no sanitation, with profound underlying health conditions, and then add COVID-19. And all of this is entirely avoidable if the European Union acted in partner with European states and just took people into the mainland, gave them a decent amount of housing and access to healthcare. Those people would be fine. They'd be like the rest of us. But instead, we're going to get a very high level of mortality, which is entirely preventable. And it will disproportionately hit, young people as much as people with underlying health conditions. Being young is not going to save people from this in those refugee camps.
But Nasar, with something like this now, and obviously with COVID being an existential threat that's going to affect everyone, I can already see the discourse is forming around where it's meant to be a global effort. I can see states jostling for nationalist positions, right? So you could frame the refugees in that discourse. So if that kind of nationalist rhetoric is was there already and it's already rearing its head, they're going to say, keep those people where they are. And already they've been dehumanized because they're brown, they're refugees. So most people, the narrative describes them as being less than human already. Yeah. So it almost becomes a kind of a foreshadowing of European and definitely Brexit policy over the last, 5 or 6 years. I would hope that given this kind of global spirit of cooperation, we would kind of try to say, look, we want to assimilate these people, because you can minimize this by assimilating people into crowds. But because Europe spent so long pushing that narrative as immigration is a no-no, foreigners are a no-no, refugees are a no-no, I don't know how we overcome that, because we've spent so long. And like I said, Trump this morning kind of cutting funding from the World Organization. That's nationalist posturing.
Yeah. So I think that's absolutely right. So, I mean, when I'm thinking about what the implications of COVID-19 is for refugees and displaced migrants, I'm thinking that there's three kind of features to it. One is the immediate things that I've kind of been describing, which is, the lack of access to healthcare, and everything that comes with that. So the immediate peril. But then there's the kind of medium and long-term things, which I think you're capturing very well, which is how will states respond to this challenge, and will they use it as a means to disembed conventions of asylum protection? Are they going to stop trying to honour international guaranteed obligations? As members of the European Union, they're also signatories of the United Nations Declaration on Refugees. And we've seen examples of that second already. We've seen countries, especially Hungary, but actually pretty much all European Union countries, with the exception of Germany and I think Sweden at the moment, have said that they're not taking any asylum seekers. Now, most of them have done that as a temporary measure, and I would suspect that a number of them would relax that in time to come, but some may not. Some may use it as a means to buttress, their nationalist ideology, which is ultimately that migrants and refugees bring danger. And there is no more clear illustration of this than health and disease, and which is not novel. Historically, the Irish were seen to bring with them cholera. Jewish minorities have historically been associated with certain kinds of diseases and pandemics and so on. But that's the challenge, isn't it? And the challenge is to make sure that that's not allowed to undermine the principles of things like non-refoulement, which is the United Nations declaration that people who enter a country through legal or non-formal means can't be returned to their site of departure because of fear of persecution or conflict or whatever. So that's a fundamental principle which I think is going to be pushed back on. But there are positives. I mean, when you look at around Europe, over the last kind of 10 to 15 years, one of the interesting developments has been the ways in which cities have responded to migration. We've seen the development of things like the Cities of Sanctuary, the Save Me campaign, the International Cities of Refuge network, the Eurocities network, which all kind of were galvanized and activated in the so-called refugee crisis. They were already there, but they really kind of had a new purpose. So when Angela Merkel said on German television during the height of that movement of people, we can do this, she was really saying that Berlin can do this, and a lot of German cities can do this. And so there's kind of a way in which you can talk about positive examples that states can kind of activate if they want to. And some states have been quite bold. So Portugal recently decided that it would give full and unfettered healthcare access to everybody who didn't have a formal migration status in Portugal, because they took the view that, they can't quarantine off people who aren't formalized in terms of their migration status, and that the public health concern is so great that they need to be bold in that approach. And they carried it off with a great deal of public support. So there are precedents for doing things differently, I think.
And thank you for that, Nasar. I guess one of my fears that I feel like you're sort of seeing on a day-to-day basis, and thinking more in terms of the UK right now, is this ever-present, what Michael Billig called the banal nationalism. And that, coupled with people's selective empathy, is really troubling, I think. Like, obviously, we've seen the resurgence of, like, symbolic discourse, language, visual representations of nationality in the UK and obviously across Europe be reinvigorated. But you're kind of seeing it branch into a new territory right now. I feel like I don't really know how to word it, but it's making me feel a bit sick watching it prevail. It's disturbing because I was saying to Tisa before we started, Tisa was saying this is an opportunity for us to do something different, for things to change, for things to be better. But I feel like people haven't got it in them to have a kind of radical love and radical empathy that's needed in a global pandemic and that is needed in this next stage of whatever society we're going to be living in. Choosing who lives and who dies, I feel like comes easier to people when you have this nationalism so deeply embedded within our day-to-day now, whether it's through the slogans that the government are now using constantly on the radio. Every time they speak, they're signing off with states. Like it reminds me so much of a general election. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the interesting features of the celebration of frontline workers has been the ways in which migration has been unavoidable, insofar as it's the people who moved here and their kids who are delivering healthcare to large swathes of the population in the NHS, but not only in the NHS, in other service sectors, care homes and service sectors where there's deliveries of goods and other things. It's kind of forced a lot of people to try to grasp that migration comes with unseen benefits which are seen to the rest of us, but not to them because they've only understood their country through a narrow prism for however long. Now, whether or not that's a momentary thing or whether or not it will have a long attraction is yet to be seen. But I suppose it's quite important that we don't let that narrative fall back to one which is crafted by those who would cast Britain back to the 1950s as being a better and nicer place when there weren't so many of people like you and I. I suppose the other feature of that is the way in which there's notions of deserving and undeserving migrants. And so, you know, great. Yeah, we love migrants when they come here, put themselves on the front line and die healing the sick. But you're not welcome unless you can show that either you've done that or you're willing to do that. That can't be the principle of sanctuary on the, you know, for the admittance or non-admittance of displaced migrants and refugees. The principle has to be one about safety and a mutual obligation, which is what's, you know, a matter of law. I mean, I'm not suggesting that countries need to be suddenly super altruistic. You know, the 51 Refugee Convention insists that asylum seekers and refugees can't be penalised for having entered the country irregularly or, you know, and in light of COVID-19, you know, the UN High Commission for Refugees has set out a clear protocol identifying and addressing the vulnerability of asylum seekers for refugees. And those things are matters of international law and convention, and states need to uphold those. Whether that then allows countries to remake common narratives of who and what we are, I suppose is yet to be seen. But what I would say is that it's early days within this kind of spiral of COVID-19 and how it unfolds. I think that there's a lot of pieces in the air, and how they land is to some extent also in our hands.
Well, what I find quite interesting is kind of put upon Chantal's point about the kind of banality of nationalism. So this idea of frontline workers. So some of the narrative's been taken. So the idea that one guy was voicing the concern that why are we clapping for NHS workers? What he was implying was, why are we clapping for immigrants? Because they came over for selfish reasons. I'm going to say thank you, but we have to realise that they came for selfish reasons. It's that kind of rejigging of that narrative that they're still separate. They're doing good stuff, but they're still separate.
It's that British exceptionalism as well. And it reminds me of Gaminda Bambra's writing and talking about British people on this island do not know where they've come from and where this country came from. Like, they think that it's an island, and it just hasn't been for such a long time. And that sort of reasserting Britain as an island right now, I feel like, is what you're seeing even in the conversations about who's on the front line, the NHS, all this stuff.
Well, yeah. I feel Nasser's argument, I kind of looked at two. So Nasser, what you're saying is kind of accepting refugees being enshrined in law. So we have, after World War II and the Great Depression, we have after World War II, we have the formation of like international organizations and kind of idea of international law, where everyone's duty bound to do something to stop a big catastrophe happening again. And I think this is the spirit of that catastrophe was the spirit that made those institutions, the UN, the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF. And I think now in 2020, we have that same kind of potential here, where we can craft law to make states meet their obligations to help the world. Because the idea that we're independent is a fallacy, it's a myth. It always has been. So we need to construct a new narrative, and I can see that in this opportunity, in this time, we can do that. But with players like Trump, people like Boris Johnson, who are, well, Trump's very clear where he stands, but someone like Johnson's on the periphery. He's playing both sides, right? Sometimes talking about society, but also acting individualistically. So I don't know where they sit, but right now I can see that moment. We can make new laws that will hold everyone accountable.
Yeah. So, I mean, in what you say, there's a lot in what both you and Chantal just said there about the kind of the mythology of the nation, you know, that post-colonial melancholia about resurrecting that wartime spirit, and you know, in the language and the presentation of the UK response to COVID-19, it very much draws upon this kind of blitz. It's a London thing, but this kind of blitz mentality of, you know, we'll pull together and we'll carry on. I mean, that's immediately punctured, isn't it, by the fact that even in the Second World War, Britain wasn't on its own. It was being buttressed by how many millions of its colonial soldiers who were fighting for various reasons. And the reality of contemporary UK food supplies. I mean, the UK has been self-sufficient in food production since, I think, around 1920, and relies heavily upon importing food, which is, you know, part of the rationale for a lot of the panic buying, that would food supplies be disrupted. So the kind of the mythology which is being presented about the UK and how it might get through COVID-19 by pulling together as one nation, as an island with a long and proud history, is of course inconsistent with what we know to be true, both historically and factually in terms of matters at hand. But there is a certain kind of currency in that, isn't there, in terms of deploying it as almost a kind of a nightly news bulletin, as if Johnson was Churchill addressing the nation, signing off on his radio broadcast.
But it works. I've come out here and I've seen people outside who are not, I would say, in the main, not politically interested, but coming out, and I can hear clapping. It works. So that's why we know it works, right? So,
but the clapping is interesting to me, right? Because I mean, so there's an ambiguity in that. Because I mean, I don't think that everybody who's taken to the doorstep to applaud, obviously not for Johnson. I don't know of anybody who was applauding for Johnson other than bots on Twitter who are claiming they're applauding for Johnson.
Yeah.
But I was outside my house last week checking, like, anyone you can clap? I want to know.
but people will come out and clap for the NHS, for frontline workers, and won't necessarily do so for nationalistic reasons, but for reasons of gratitude.
Of course.
Now, I mean, that's kind of to some extent, that's a bit of a naive reading, because then it's a question of how that gratitude is framed and mobilized by political actors, and who will take it as, to some extent, a confirmation, an indirect applause for what they do. You know, Matt Hancock and others joining in with the clapping is almost a means of appropriating that affection for frontline workers and so on. But there is something in that which is about society and about some being more than the constituent of its parts. And there's a rediscovery, which is part of the hope, I think, Tiso, in this affair, that there's a rediscovery of society and the virtue of pulling together, not on the grounds of some fantasy of the past, but on the understanding that pooled resources and efforts are what are virtuous, as opposed to kind of a highly individualized approach to public health care and indeed, how we live in our homes and in our neighborhoods. So I think that's a point for optimism. The question is to what extent that's racialized or not, and who gets to be in the common we. And that goes back to the point we were discussing earlier, which is I think it's really hard to avoid the fact that so much of the contribution, and indeed the contribution which leads to a disproportionate number of fatalities, is visually, by black and ethnic minorities in this country. That you just can't get away from that.
Right.
And I can't help but think that will force people to rethink who they think they are in effect, or certainly who they think other people who don't look like them are.
Well, I spoke to my friend the other day, and he said to me he didn't believe the statistics about black Americans being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. He didn't believe about the UK statistics about black and minority ethnics. So he's a white guy, working class, owns his own business. He said it's not true. And I'm like, why would you make that up? Why would someone make that? But this is, in the age of conspiracy, how it's racialized. They don't believe. Like they still see, in his case, he thinks it's post-racial. He thinks racism ended in 1945 or something like that.
And I think in a less extreme version than that, although I do agree that there are definitely people that are saying that type of thing, but in a less extreme version than that, there's almost an uncomfortableness about when you say that to people as well. Actually, like a few days ago, it was like 100% of the doctors that had died were black or Asian, and like you're almost hit, like I haven't heard it on the news yet, and listeners, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure someone has said it, a right-wing pundit, but the accusation of making this about race and it actually being about equalize, it's a global pandemic, it affects everyone equally. No, it doesn't. But like I still feel like that pushback, even though that we know that this is the case, that it is so the like they make up black and minority ethnic people in the NHS make up 13%, I think, of the NHS workforce, and 75% of people that have died now, or so. Like,
it's about partly it's about the uses and misuses of concepts and categories, isn't it? I mean, why is ethnicity and race an explanatory factor when we're trying to get a handle on, I don't know, grooming gangs or elevated levels of criminality? Why does ethnicity and race help us there, as in the reporting of it, and certainly by the right wing, the framing of the issue? But why does ethnicity and race help us to understand frontline service, disproportionate impacts and inequalities? Let's not talk about race when it's about inequality, but let's talk about race when it allows us to absolve ourselves of responsibility for a particular social outcome. I think that one of the challenges that the UK and other European Union countries are going to face is when the immediate lockdown is to some extent relaxed. And, we may have lots of kind of stop and start lockdowns, hold and release until a vaccination is made available, is how they then honour their obligations, even if they want to disperse migrants and refugees, in the context of having been complicit in this deeply racialized and toxic discourse around migrants and refugees over the past however many years. Even in countries like Sweden, which has been relatively progressive in terms of taking in the most vulnerable, there's a racialized rhetoric there, which has become more so around health and disease and so on. And when the state wants to switch back, if there's a will, then it will have to deal with that. And it'll have to come up with a common story about who and what we are now in the light of this post-COVID world to be able to do it. Because I don't think you can easily turn back the rhetoric or dial. I mean, you can dial it down, but what has been said and how arguments have been framed will have a legacy. And that, to some extent, is worrying me a bit more. I mean, I'm hugely worried about the immediate impact of COVID-19. I think there's going to be possibly thousands of totally avoidable deaths in Europe. Yeah. But that's an immediate concern. And once we're past that, I don't see how we're going to be able to move past some of the bigger things, which is, well, okay, the right thing is to take people into the country and support them as we are required to do and would benefit the country overall. But you have to then deal with the popular rhetoric around migration and disease. And I think that's going to be a bigger challenge.
I think that will have to change it. In light of what's to come economically, in light of what they're predicting, the depression, and it's a global contraction. And remember places, like countries in Africa, like from Mauritania to Nigeria, they can't do social distancing. So they haven't got infrastructure to put in place to keep people safe. So people will vote with their feet and leave those countries.
Yeah.
Because that's what people do when they look for a better life. So European laws around migration, even global laws around migration, will need to change because people will from all parts of the world will be on the move, either because they feel unsafe or they're looking for a better life. This global contraction of 3%. The last depression lasted 10 years, and this one's supposed to be worse. So we've got 10 years, well, potentially 10 years or more of economic stress and duress around the globe. So people were looking for opportunities wherever they can. And that's the human story, looking for opportunities where you can. So nation states will need to kind of either change the rhetoric around who is the other, because even by our own account, we have a demographic crisis in the UK prior to this contraction, prior to this pandemic, prior to the depression. So what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to look for a new narrative to explain people and how we're going to get ahead.
I think that Europe's long had a demographic challenge in terms of the weighting of the population. And in some countries, it's more pronounced than others. So in Italy, for a long time, the levels of fertility have been really low and the population has aged. And, you know, that's had implications for the tax base and then a question of both caring for the elderly and so on. Despite that, it's never the reality of that has never translated into a more progressive or open-minded political culture. You would think that out of self-interest, if nothing else, that would prevail. What has happened is spaces of kind of hope and progress within particular countries, and they're often at the local level, at the city level. So in the way in which I was talking about Germany and other cities in Northern Europe, that's very true of cities in the south of Europe. Places like Riace and Cosenza in Calabria have been part of a tradition of welcoming cities. And we've done some work out there in the past where we've wandered around the piazza in the main square, and old women who kind of lived there for a long time will come to say to us in Italian, and we've got colleagues who translated for us, would say to us, "Isn't it marvelous? We can hear children's voices in the square, and we never thought we'd hear children in this town again. You know, because of internal migration, people fled to the north of Italy, or people left Italy, and so these towns have historically been depopulated, and then they were repopulated by displaced migrants and refugees, and that meant that a school could be opened, a hospital was created, there was local economies. So there's spaces of hope within countries in Europe for doing things differently and for responding to the needs of displaced migrants and refugees in a way in which is constructive. The challenge is to scale that up to something more than the local. And how does it remake the national? And then ideally, how does it remake, a vision of what Europe is? And I suspect that rather than a softening of borders with any COVID-19 global migration, as in the last refugee crisis, which was perpetuated with push factor, perpetuated by conflict and war and famine, I think we'll get another kind of let's stop them crossing the Mediterranean. Let's police the water. Let's do a deal with Turkey, which means that they don't cross over. And then, human beings get turned into weaponized. Turkey will occasionally let people cross into Europe when the EU is not playing ball with Turkey. And that's quite a depressing prospect, I think.
Oh, guys, we're going to have to wrap up there.
Okay.
There was some hope in that last bit, Nasar, but equally some very terrifying.
All right.
Well, we hope you are all keeping safe, staying home if you can, and yeah, sending you all love and solidarity during this time. Peace.
Take care. See you.